This panel is basically revisiting and having a conversation about some of the issues that we discussed in the January issue of the NACLA report on the Americas, this year's January issue, which was basically assessing sort of 1 year into the Obama presidency, what we really know about his Latin America policy and what we can expect moving forward. When we started to put the issue together, things were still very much up in the air. Valenzuela was still being held up. He hadn't yet been confirmed. The Honduran coup had happened, but things were still unclear as to what was going to actually turn out. The Colombian base agreement had just been signed. So we had some sort of vague inklings of where Obama was going to go. And we realized in the process of putting this issue together under the leadership of the NACLA editor, Pablo, here in the front, that the sort of overriding issue for a lot of these things was the theme of militarization, that what we actually see in Latin America is a continuation of a militarization of various aspects of U.S. Latin America policy that's been happening for the last 30 years. And what we're really seeing is that Obama hasn't changed that trend toward militarization. So what we're going to talk about today, we have 3 panelists here today. We're going to talk about various aspects of that. And I can introduce each of them briefly. We'll just go this way. So Joe Nevins is a professor at Vassar College, has a piece in the report here. Suzanna Reiss teaches at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, great, which is an amazing job. I hope that someday I'm so lucky to get a job like that. And Mark Weisbrot is one of the co-directors of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. So because we're a little late, I'm just going to let you guys get started, and hopefully after each of the presentations happens, we can have a little bit of a conversation about some of the other topics that maybe we're not going to touch on in detail here, but we also want to talk about.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank NACLA for putting this together and inviting me to participate. I'm going to talk a bit about immigration, and that might not seem as a logical component of a focus on militarization in Latin America, but the logic of militarization and security more broadly permeate the immigration debate and certainly the Obama administration's approach to immigration enforcement thus far. And I want to open it by actually reading an excerpt from a recent report posted on the NACLA website by Todd Miller. It was posted on March 8th of this year. It's about Haiti. 5 years after an earthquake in Haiti on January 12, an Air Force cargo plane flew one of the first missions of the U.S. military's aid effort. The plane flew for 5 hours over the devastated country, broadcasting the loud, pre-recorded voice of Raymond Josehp, the Haitian ambassador to the United States, in Creole. Quote, this is Ambassador Josehp speaking. "If you think you will reach the U.S. and all the doors will be wide open to you, that's not at all the case. They will intercept you right in the water and send you back home where you came from." End quote. The disembodied voice from the sky told Haitians, still stunned by the earthquake that killed more than 250,000 people, that U.S. immigration policy toward Haiti would remain the same as it has for decades. This was despite the fact that just a few days earlier, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security had announced 18 months of temporary protective services for Haitians who had been in the United States before January 12th, and that all deportations in process would be stopped. However, Coast Guard Lieutenant Chris O'Neill, the spokesperson for the newly formed Homeland Security Task Force in charge of managing any influx of Haitian migrants or refugees coming from that country, said simply, quote, "The goal is to interdict them at sea and repatriate them." Now, Todd goes on to write about a new mass migration plan under the Department of Homeland Security called Operation Vigilant Sentry. Right? It's prepared for the possibility of a significant outflux of Haitian migrants toward the United States by sending 16 new Coast Guard cutters to roam the waters around Haiti. The ships are on the lookout for 50-foot boats, like the one they found on February 17th, packed with 88 migrants heading towards the United States. It's the 4th such boat, according to Todd, that they returned to Haiti since the earthquake. Though officials from the U.S. claim that there hasn't been a significant increase in migration from Haiti in comparison to previous years, the Department of Homeland Security recently contracted something called the GEO Group, which is formerly known as Wackenhut Incorporated, for what they're calling GUARD services. I have a Boston accent, right? GUARD, G-U-A-R-D, GUARD services. And they're going to presumably put these in a tent city in Guantanamo Bay in case of an influx of Haitian migrants. Right? Meanwhile, more space has been made available at the Chrome Detention Center in Miami, Florida. Now, the one minor amendment I would want to make to Todd's excellent report on NACLA.org is that the extension of temporary protected services or temporary protected status to Haitian migrants in the United States without authorization does not apply to all unauthorized migrants. You have to apply for temporary protected status, and you only get it if you can jump through a bunch of hoops that relate to quote-unquote criminal background. Right? If you've committed any felony and been convicted of it, right, and what constitutes a felony for a non-citizen is very different from what constitutes for a citizen. Right? So any crime that carries a penalty of 1 year or more makes you ineligible for temporary protected status. If you've committed a crime of moral turpitude, right, which in the city of New York includes jumping a subway turnstile without paying, you could be ineligible for temporary protected status. And if you've been convicted of immigration fraud, which, as you might guess, lots of undocumented or unauthorized migrants have been convicted of, you also might be ineligible for temporary protected status. So it only applies to a particular percentage, that percentage being unknown, of unauthorized Haitian migrants. That said, the larger point that he wants to make about sort of the securitized approach to Haitian migration is right on. And in many ways, what Todd writes about in the amendment I just made speaks volumes to the Obama administration's approach to immigration enforcement thus far. It's one that sees the third world, so-called third world, primarily as a security threat. Right? It's one that embraces security first. It's one that takes a law and order approach with some minor, relatively liberal changes on the margins. Right? Now, sort of the first indication of what at least rhetorically, of what the Obama administration's approach might look like was provided in an address by Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano in November of last year. She said that the administration would pursue reforms that are true to an American identity that, quote, is one both as a nation of immigrants and a nation of laws. Right? In this way, Napolitano asserted what the Obama administration would do would be to avoid the pitfalls of 1986. In 1986, the Reagan administration, amazing to think about this, right? The Reagan administration passed something called the Immigration Reform and Control Act. Right? It was an act that eventually legalized the status of about 3 million unauthorized migrants, and at the same time provided a significant infusion of enforcement resources. But from the perspective of Napolitano and the Obama administration more broadly, what took place under IRCA was very problematic, because what she said was the enforcement part of the equation was promised, but it didn't materialize. And as a result, we see the so-called crisis that we have today, right, where there's an estimated, 12 to 20 million people in the United States without authorization. And that's exactly what they want to avoid in terms of the reforms that are being proposed now. Now, when I say comprehensive immigration reform, right, it's sort of a moving target. It's a very broad category. In many ways, it's shorthand for a variety of often disparate positions that, at a minimum, right, want to legalize the status or regularize the status of many, if not most, of the people that are in the United States without authorization, and at the same time change immigration enforcement practices. And those changes range from the more draconian to the fairly to the relatively humane and liberal, right? Now, I want to argue in the next few minutes is that what we should expect in terms of CIR vis-a-vis the Obama administration is relatively little, and there's three main reasons for that. One is a climate of ongoing and perhaps intensifying nativism and xenophobia, right? That's the first reason. Two, the ideological and political limitations of Obama and the Obama administration. And three, what people are referring to in various ways as the national security complex, of which immigration enforcement is the central component. Right. In terms of nativism and xenophobia, there's really not much to say. The United States, it's true, is a country of immigrants. At the same time, it is and always has been a country of deep and widespread anti-immigrant sentiment. This goes all the way back to the Puritans and the Pilgrims. I mean, if you read the writings of Benjamin Franklin, for example, he railed against immigrants, specifically German immigrants, who he called the most stupid of their nation, and he worried about the possibility that there were going to be street signs in German soon in the United States, right? Or what became the United States. Right? We see this type of sentiment, obviously, in many places in the United States today. The likes of Lou Dobbs, the likes of the Tea Party movement, and others who call into question, for example, in a really crazy way, Obama's eligibility to be president, on the basis of where he was born or not born. All right, so that's the first reason, and I don't want to understate the importance of that, but in a lot of ways I think that's overly focused on, exaggerated, and helps to serve as a smokescreen or obscures us from seeing what I think are ultimately far more important dynamics at work that are limiting the possibilities for sort of left reforms vis-a-vis immigration. And those more important dynamics are the ideological and political limitations of the political mainstream, including the Democratic Party. Now, people might recall that National Journal characterized Obama as the most liberal member of the Senate in 2007. And U.S. Border Control, a highly restrictionist organization, labeled him an open border advocate. Ojalá, as they say in Spanish, right? But such labels are misleading in terms of Obama's actual voting record. And if you look at the restrictionist organization FAIR, Federation for American Immigration Reform, they actually tracked very closely Obama's voting record in the 110th Congress, 2007 to 2009. And there were a total of 15 votes that concerned FAIR. On those 15 votes, Obama was not present for 4 of them. Out of the 11 votes for which he was present, he voted 7 times in line with FAIR's position. Right? So he's very much in the political mainstream vis-a-vis immigration and boundary enforcement, and it's a mainstream that I want to emphasize is incredibly narrow, right, in terms of the divergence of opinions in terms of what should happen. Right. Now, the signs of on the ground in terms of Obama's ideological limitations since assuming the presidency is one, his first budget proposal, right, which called for funding 20,000 Border Patrol agents. And it's important to emphasize, I think, just how fundamentally conservative and at the same time radical this position is, right? It took until 1976, 1977, more than 50 years after the U.S. Border Patrol was founded, for the size of the Border Patrol to reach 2,000 agents. Right? So from 1924 to 1976 to 1977, the size of the Border Patrol went from 0 to 2,000. Today in 2010, we're at 20,000 agents. Right? It's increased tenfold in about 3 decades. Right? And so that Obama can just sort of rubber stamp that and say it's fine is indicative of just how radically the debate and things on the ground have changed over the last few decades. Right? Now, the Obama administration claims, in Napolitano's words, that its overall approach is very, very different than what vis-a-vis what we saw under Bush II. But the fact is, what we're seeing under Obama is, to the extent what we're seeing under Obama is more similar, a lot more similar than it is different. Right? And one way to look at that, one place to look at that is on deportations, right? Napolitano and the Obama administration is bragging that they've actually increased the number of deportations, right? The last time I checked, the deportations under Obama, in terms of if we calculate them over a 1-year period, are 25% higher than they were under George Bush II. This has taken place despite the administrations having put an end to these high-profile workplace raids that created a lot of problems, at least in terms of publicity and political resistance to the Bush administration. But what the Obama administration has done instead is to engage in a more a softer, kinder, gentler approach to these types of workplace raids. And instead of engaging in these high-profile raids where immigration enforcement agents enter a factory and tear people out, what they're doing is sending what they call no-match letters. Right? So they'll send letters to an employer. They'll get the employer's database. Right? Look at the social security card numbers, and then they'll check to see if they match their database. Right? To the extent they don't, they send letters to the employer and say, you have X amount of time, a month or 2 months, to get these people to either clarify their status, to make sure that the match is actually correct, right? The number is actually correct, and if it's not correct, to get rid of them. Right? An example of how this works, American Apparel Company in Los Angeles was forced by the Department of Homeland Security in the fall to fire 1,800 employees, about a quarter of its workforce, right? After federal authorities found problems with their identity documents. According to Monsignor Cunane, the pastor to many of these fired workers in Los Angeles, he said, as far as the families involved are concerned, this is a quote, it's just your old immigration raid without the photo op. Right? Now, it's interesting to think about this because it got very, very little attention, right, in the United States, this mass firing of 1,800 workers in American Apparel. And when you compare the size of that firing to what took place under the Bush administration, it dwarfs these high-profile raids that took place under Bush. So just for example, people might recall in May 2008 in Postville, Iowa, there was this, at a kosher meatpacking plant, there was this big raid that involved 389 arrests. Right? The biggest raid in U.S. history, which took place under the Bush administration, was in Laurel, Mississippi, an electronics factory that involved 595 arrests. Right? Under Obama, right, American Apparel was 1,800 arrests. Right? 3 times that raid in Laurel, Mississippi. Right? How are we doing in terms of time?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. No, they're not. They're not. Okay. I mean, they're fired, right? They're not necessarily arrested, okay, or deported, right? Okay. The Obama administration's approach is to focus on what they call criminal aliens, right? So people that have arrest records, right? So if they have no arrest record, they'll probably be left alone. But they're trying to, at the same time, make their life so miserable, right, by finding that they'll sort of self-deport, if you will. Right? Okay. The last thing I want to focus on is this national security complex. And for people who are interested in sort of following this, probably the best reporting on this or analysis on this is on a blog called Borderlines by Tom Barry, who works out of Silver City, New Mexico, but I think it's associated with the Institute for Policy Studies or something like that. All right, so if you just blog Tom Barry, Borderlines, you'll come up with his blog site, and he goes into this. The Border Patrol, as I mentioned earlier, has grown enormously over the last few decades, right? And this is part and parcel of this larger enforcement apparatus. The Department of Homeland Security, which emerged in 2003 officially, is now the 3rd biggest federal agency. Its budget is $55 billion this year. It has 220,000 employees, right? The majority of them focus on immigration-related offenses or transgressions, right? But even the parts of the Department of Homeland Security that wouldn't seem obviously related to immigration, like the Coast Guard, for example, also expend a good amount of the resources focusing on immigration. As a result of this sort of institutional monster, right, the debate and the policy recommendations that are related to that debate are increasingly distorted and narrow. Right? It wasn't until 1980 that the Republican Party mentioned immigration enforcement for the first time in the Republican National Platform. It wasn't until 1996, the Democratic Party did the same thing. Right? It's not to say, obviously, that there wasn't immigration restrictionism, right? There wasn't anti-immigrant sentiment prior to these times, but it does suggest how recent sort of the deep, institutionalized, consistent focus on immigration enforcement is. It's only in the last few decades. And the Department of Homeland Security, in many ways, is the institutional embodiment of that. And as a result of these sort of ideological institutional shifts, it's increasingly difficult to have far-ranging discussions, at least ones that would, that would smack of anything left, vis-a-vis the spirit of the left forum. Finally, let me just say something about what looks like it's on the table right now in terms of immigration reform. Tomorrow, of course, is a big march in Washington, D.C., or what's hoped to be a big march in favor of comprehensive immigration reform. The other day in the Washington Post, there was an article by Senator Charles Schumer, Democrat of New York, and Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina. And they're the people that are pushing most vociferously some sort of comprehensive immigration reform in the Senate. And that's the position that's closest to the Obama administration. And just to read a paragraph from it, this op-ed, it gives you an idea of what they're talking about. Our plan has 4 pillars: requiring biometric Social Security cards to ensure that illegal workers cannot get jobs. That's the first thing. Second, fulfilling and strengthening our commitments on border security and interior enforcement. So they're talking about growing the size of the Border Patrol even more, creating a process for admitting temporary workers. That's number 3. And fourth, implementing a tough but fair path to legalization for all those already here. What that means is there'll be many people who are already here that will not be eligible, right, for a legalization or regularization of status because of some sort of criminal conviction that they have, right, which is a very, very significant percentage of the unauthorized immigrant population. Right? As a result of this sort of narrowing, what we can expect to see, right, from the Obama administration and Congress is a big stick in terms of increased enforcement and a small carrot in terms of regularization of status for those people who are already here. And the hope of the Obama administration and their supporters in Congress is that this will be the final big immigration reform. Right? Because what they think they can do now, because of the technologies that are available, because of the size of the enforcement apparatus, because of the size of the institutional support mechanisms that are in place, they can create a system in which immigration can be policed in a way was never even imaginable 20, 30, 40 years ago. Right? That they actually can regulate who comes in, who's here, and in the process of doing so, right, create sort of a neoliberalized system, right, where immigration is controlled on the basis of the dictates of the needs of business. Right? So it's both securitized, right, and neoliberalized. Right? Of course, it will fail, like all systems of control fail. Right? And what we'll be facing in 20, 30, 40 years, assuming comprehensive immigration reform passes, is a system in which there'll still be large numbers of people in the United States with authorization, but their existence will be made far more difficult. They'll be driven farther underground. But the enforcement apparatus and the system of control that they face will be even greater than it is today. Right? In short, the task of the left, to the extent that we want to see a less militarized, a more humane, a more solidarity-like system of immigration for all, a sort of a basic minimum of a leftist program, we have a very tall task in front of us. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, it's great to be here. And I have to say a special thank you to Pablo for all the editorial assistance and help he did organizing, not just the issue of the magazine, but also this panel. So thank you.
Speak louder.
Okay, I'll try to speak louder. Maybe I'm going to actually... No, it's okay. Okay. So what I'm going to be speaking about is the Obama administration's drug policies in relation to Latin America. And I'm drawing this largely from the piece that I contributed to the January-February issue of NACLA. In the first year of the Obama administration, the administration has embraced in its first year, and even extended its predecessor's militaristic counter-narcotics policies in the Americas. In doing so, it has also adopted the basic tenets and priorities that have shaped U.S. drug control policies for decades. Among the most prominent examples are the administration's decision to deploy U.S. military personnel to Colombian bases, the decertification this past year of Bolivia and Venezuela as having, quote, failed demonstrably in upholding counter-narcotics agreements, the continued funding for Plan Colombia, and Obama's expansion of the Merida Initiative, the regional security partnership brokered by the Bush administration with Mexico in October 2007. Under Obama's watch, funding for this initiative almost doubled in 2009, bringing it to a total of $830 million, and that makes that particular policy the country's largest foreign aid program. All of this unfolded even as the director of National Drug Control Policy, R. Gil Kurlikowski, suggested that the new administration was making a historic shift on drug policy. He said, quote, "It's become increasingly clear that the metaphor and philosophy of a war on drugs is flawed. It's time to adopt a different approach." The Obama administration has made some gestures in this direction, most significantly making it a low priority for federal law enforcement to go after state-authorized medical marijuana retailers and suggesting a new orientation towards prevention and treatment. However, I want to argue that to genuinely change the metaphors and philosophy animating the so-called war on drugs, it's essential to understand and question the international political and economic foundations of U.S. drug policy. These much neglected foundations continue to fuel violence, repression, and economic coercion both within and beyond the United States borders. The drug war has failed to achieve even its stated goals. As critics have long emphasized, there has been no net decrease in illicit drug production and trafficking, even while the devastating human and environmental costs of drug war militarism continue to rise. Meanwhile, rarely discussed is the drug war's great success in helping to achieve unstated goals, particularly extending U.S. military and economic power. And within that power includes, I want to argue and bring attention to, the extension of the reach of the American legal drug economy, which often depends on the raw materials and consumer markets in the very same territories that are forced to participate in the U.S.-led drug control regime. We must challenge the seemingly neutral language of supply and demand and the notions of legality that permeate drug policy discourse. Both indicate, I argue, capitalism's shaping influence on the ideology of U.S. drug war policies. Rather than presuming that the international flow of drugs is a consequence of the natural workings of a mythical, often naturalized free market, it's more useful to ask who gets to supply what and who gets to demand. Inequities between the global north and south have historically structured the answer to those questions. So the language of supply and demand, much as the designation legal and illegal, must be understood as political and historical constructions rather than as neutral descriptive categories. The system of drug control itself has given these categories and labels substantive power. Attempts to control Andean Coca provide one instructive example of how this works. The region has been on the international drug control radar since the aftermath of World War II, when the UN Committee on Narcotic Drugs sent a commission to Peru and Bolivia. At the time, they were the two primary producers of the coca leaf. Today, because of a consequence of the drug war, has been that it's pushed the growing and the processing of coca leaves into cocaine into regions in places like Colombia. But at that time, it was Peru and Bolivia. They sent this commission down as part of a broader effort to regulate what they saw as the raw materials for drug commodities. Arguing that indigenous coca consumption was addictive and destructive, the UN commissioners recommended that traditional coca leaf consumption be abolished. And this is a practice I should emphasize that has been going, chewing coca leaves is part of indigenous tradition that goes back for millennia. The only envisioned legal market for Andean coca leaves were those destined for export, a market that was completely dominated by the United States. This goal was codified in the 1961 Single Drug Convention, which dictated that all traditional domestic coca consumption be eradicated in 25 years and that the market be carefully monitored to ensure supplies remained in licit channels. Thus, the international drug control regime itself structured Andean countries' participation within the drug trade as supply-side sources of raw materials. This is how they created their perception of those countries within the international drug regulatory framework. To this day, coca leaves are processed by pharmaceutical companies authorized by the United States government to produce a flavoring extract for Coca-Cola, the biggest coca consumer, legal coca consumer, and to manufacture cocaine for use in research laboratories and as a local anesthetic in medicine. A lot of people don't realize that Coca-Cola still uses the coca leaves when in the processing or the production of their drink. The drug control regime that emerged in the 1950s was just that, a system.
Pepsi too?
No, Pepsi doesn't. I'm sure you could trace commodities in Pepsi that have a similarly nefarious route to get into the beverage, but no. The drug control regime that emerged in the 1950s was just that. It was a system of control, not outright prohibition. Drugs themselves were not illegal. Cocaine and other controlled substances straddled the licit and illicit divide since their legal status depended on their circulation within the marketplace. It depended on who it was that grew, manufactured, sold, and consumed them. One of the more dramatic and mostly unquestioned contradictions is that while the United States spends billions of dollars attacking drugs, the legal drug industry is regularly among the top 5 most profitable industries in the country. North Americans are notoriously quick to turn to drugs to answer their ailments, medical or otherwise. Meanwhile, through direct marketing, the pharmaceutical industry encourages the excessive consumption of drugs that are often of questionable medical value. Internationally, drugs have always served as a measure of the United States' wealth and influence. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, pharmaceutical preparations represent by far the most profitable commodities exported from the country, which is partly the result of free trade agreements like the Andean Trade Promotion and Drug Eradication Act, whose title alone indicates the intimate connection, Andean Trade Promotion and Drug Eradication, the intimate connection between economic relations and U.S. police and military collaboration. These agreements establish preferential access for legal U.S. drugs in foreign markets. They extend their patents and include a number of other measures that propel the dominance of the U.S. pharmaceutical industry around the world. The United States does not so much wage war on drugs, I want to suggest, as wage war with drugs. Throughout the 20th century, the U.S. government has considered certain drugs, including most recently flu vaccines, as strategic materials and has subsidized their mass production and stockpiling in the interests of national security. Drugs, among other things, can numb a soldier's pain, stimulate and ease labor, and vaccinate against disease, giving them special strategic value. Obama's continuation of the U.S. embargo against Cuba is a good example of how this can work in terms of exerting diplomatic leverage. The embargo includes policies which limit the availability of critical medicines, and it shows how drugs' medicinal value, as I'm suggesting, has also been deployed to exert coercive diplomatic leverage. A U.S. company selling drugs to Cuba in this context would be committing a crime. And I think that's one example that really reveals the limits of drug war rhetoric that so often focus on an underworld of illicit drug production. Invocations of national security trump public health concerns in determining people's access to legal drugs. And this is true both domestically and internationally. This was on dramatic display when the president addressed Congress last September. While Republican Joe Wilson received a lot of attention for his indecorous outburst, "You lie," less attention was paid to Obama's chilling statement which prompted this outburst, namely providing assurance, if only it was a lie, that health care provision will, quote, not apply to those who are here illegally. The president also indicated that he might allow an exception for, again, this is a quote, children who may be here illegally but are still in playgrounds or at schools and potentially are passing on illnesses and communicable diseases, presumably to legal children. And I think that's a distinction that dramatically embodies the dehumanizing impact of the logic of drug control. Drug warriors in the United States and at the United Nations, the main international body regulating the drug trade, divide the countries of the world into drug suppliers, mostly in Latin America and Central and Southeast Asia, and consumers, primarily North America and Europe. This formulation has had a definitive impact on both the thrust of drug control initiatives and on the arguments presented by those who challenge them. So, for example, the United States spends the vast majority of drug war funding on interdiction campaigns in supply countries, constituting some 65% of federal drug control expenditures. Some governments in Latin America have welcomed this funding, in particular the presidents of Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, who have all embraced the drug war as a powerful tool in their efforts to consolidate political control within their countries and to finance counterinsurgency wars against political and economic dissidents. But there have also been demands from across the region, including among the United States allies, that the U.S. government do more to limit domestic consumption, as well as to limit its involvement in supplying the precursor chemicals and weapons that are essential to illicit production and distribution. The Obama administration has had a somewhat novel response to this diplomatic challenge. Unlike his predecessor, Obama has acknowledged a deeper U.S. role in the illicit drug trade. In April, when a number of administration officials, including the President and the Secretary of State, traveled to Mexico to show support for President Felipe Calderon's war on the cartels, Obama declared that he would not pretend that combating drugs is Mexico's responsibility alone. He continued, quote, "A demand for these drugs in the United States is what is helping to keep these cartels in business. This war is being waged with guns purchased not here, but in the United States." Yet, the administration's acknowledgement of what was referred to as shared responsibilities has helped only to cement the ongoing militarization of the region. The devastating impact of this approach has been well documented: increased levels of violence, political corruption, and a blurring of the line between the police, the military, and drug cartels in ways that profoundly undermine democracy and human rights. The limits of a supply-demand framework extend to the weapons deployed in the conflict. The Obama administration provides Mexico with billions of dollars to buy U.S. manufactured weapons, Black Hawk helicopters, surveillance equipment, and police training, making the United States the major source of both legal and illegal weapons that are flooding the streets of Mexico. Embodying the U.S. orientation towards supply-side interdiction, the U.S. president each year identifies major illicit producing as well as transit countries and then determines whether they cooperate with the international drug control regime. In September, Obama identified 20 countries as major drug transit or major illicit drug producing countries, and of these 20, a total number of 15, the vast majority of them were in Latin America and the Caribbean. And of these major supplying countries, Obama designated 3, Bolivia, Burma, and Venezuela, as, quote, countries that have failed demonstrably during the previous 12 months to adhere to their obligations under international counter-narcotics agreements. This designation, or decertification, as it's more commonly known, empowers the United States to withhold aid and deny preferential treatment under existing trade agreements with those countries. The supply-demand formulation deployed in this context, the selective designation of countries as major drug suppliers and as having failed by asserting their willingness to assessing their willingness to collaborate with a particular system of international drug control, recasts diplomatic struggles not as political or economic conflict, but as conflicts over the pursuit of criminality and terrorism. The political ideologies associated with governments in the hemisphere, not the actual health consequences or violence emanating from struggles over control of the drug trade, have determined the certification process. If this was not the case, Colombia and Mexico, as the major producer country and the largest transit country respectively, would undoubtedly top the blacklist of drug war failures with their thousands of displaced peoples, environmental devastation, and documented human rights abuses. Yet it is Bolivia and Venezuela that have been branded as drug control rogue states, primarily as an outcome of political tensions between these nations and the United States. And in this issue of the NACLA Journal, John Lindsay Poland actually has an article where he talks more extensively about the agreement now that's in place that the Obama administration completed. It was begun under the Bush administration to give American military personnel access to bases in Colombia, which has also really is sort of one of the outcomes of these collaborations is that it's fueling a drug war in the region. It also sort of embodies the unequal political power embedded in these kinds of relationships where you have American soldiers and civilian personnel who travel to those bases with diplomatic immunity, and conflicts that emerge, there's a part of the agreement was that any conflict that did emerge, it was prohibited from going to an international body to resolve it. So it sort of shows the power that the United States wields partially through these agreements that come about largely in the name of waging a war on drug cartels. Bolivia provides a useful counterexample to Colombia of how drug war spectacle masks political conflict by using decertification as a tool to criminalize challenges to U.S. hegemony. The Obama administration's decertification of Bolivia defies any rational fact-based justification. It seems instead to be a retaliatory move for actions the Bolivian government took in the fall of 2008 when it did not renew U.S. aid contracts, accused the DEA of spying, expelled the U.S. ambassador, and alleged that the United States was providing covert support for the violent and economically powerful U.S.-aligned opposition within the country. After the White House said Bolivia had failed to live up to its, quote, shared responsibility, Bolivian President Evo Morales fired back, accusing Obama of having lied to Latin America at the Summit of the Americas last April, when the U.S. president said, quote, there is no senior partner and junior partner in the United States hemispheric relations. Further challenging the inequality built into the economic roles assigned to various countries in the drug economy, the Bolivian government formally submitted a request that's now under review at the United Nations to have coca leaf removed from the 1961 convention. The convention's restrictions and prohibition of coca leaf chewing, the Morales administration argued, violates the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, among a number of other international treaties. And essentially what Evo Morales is arguing for is the ability to participate in the legal market on terms that are defined by the populations involved in producing, growing, and consuming the crop. Morales was reelected to a second term in December, And he's not alone in challenging the U.S. drug war. Leaders across Latin America are seeking not only to expand their right to participate in the legal drug market, but also to question the validity of the control and enforcement regime itself. They increasingly question U.S. drug control priorities, emphasizing its many failures. In August, the first Latin American Conference on Drug Policy, which brought together representatives from an array of the region's governments, international organizations, and community groups, concluded that, quote, Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia, the three countries that together produce the entirety of the world production of cocaine, did not manage in 10 years to reduce the acres of coca cultivation, but instead gained 2 million refugees, put peasants in jail, and sprayed pesticides that degrade the environment. So there's a growing awareness and a movement to really challenge the thrust of drug control policies that I think is hopeful, even if the task is quite daunting. The capitalist ideology that sustains the United States' ongoing drug war in the Americas manifests not only in the assumptions built into the supply-demand model, but it's also present in the very notion that drugs themselves cause crime and violence, as Kurlikowski said when he announced the administration's professedly forward-thinking and practical approach to drug policy. Focusing on the commodity overshadows the people and political struggles at the heart of the drug conflict. It is not drugs per se, but rather competition to control their production, distribution, and consumption that has generated violence over the past half-century. Personifying drugs themselves as criminal, violent agents has served as a useful mechanism for obscuring the real human impact of drug control policies since well before Nixon's time. Despite the frequently staged spectacles of drug enforcement officers burning marijuana fields in California or airplanes fumigating coca fields in the Andes, it's necessary, I think, to restate the obvious. The United States has never waged a war on drugs. Rather, it has waged wars, or various wars, on specific groups of people. Take, for example, African Americans in the United States, who are disproportionately represented in the U.S. prison population, even though most licit and illicit drug users in the United States are white. The domestic drug war since the introduction of the first mandatory minimum sentences in the 1950s has always been structured by racial and economic bias. Similarly, the burdens of U.S.-led drug wars in Latin America have fallen disproportionately on indigenous communities, many of which have fled drug war violence or lost access to their economic means of survival, caught in the political crossfire between governments and opposition movements, which both capitalize on the drug trade as a means of waging war for political power. The Obama administration's early rhetorical shift away from drug war rhetoric continues, I think, the government's dishonest assessment of what fuels drug production and consumption, and fails to acknowledge the violence that maximizing profits and monopolizing international drug flows requires. Domestically, in the country with the world's highest incarceration rate, the fact that most imprisoned people are serving time for drug-related offenses has yet to become a serious topic in the Obama administration's deliberations on drug policy. On the international stage, the power hierarchies of who gets to supply and who gets to demand also ripple through racial, economic, and social disparities. Until the administration pays attention to the structural origins of the war on drugs, as well as the profound international dependencies upon which it has always rested, it will be fated, I believe, to continue pursuing an ill-conceived, destructive, and failed policy under which the value of drugs is determined by war and economic inequality rather than our common humanity. Thank you.
So, thanks to Joe and Suzanna for that nice overview of two aspects of the militarization of U.S. policy in the hemisphere. I'm glad I don't have to cover that now. Just to follow up on two things. One, that the Coca, the struggle over Coca. First of all, I really like Coca tea, if you've ever had it. The only place I ever have it now is at the Bolivian embassy. Sure. And it is, I mean, the Bolivians are not going to give in on this, you know, and it's just kind of ridiculous. And it also is, I think, one of the things that shows how much it is not so much related to the drug production itself as to them getting a foothold in the military and in the security forces, is the Bolivian coca doesn't even end up in the United States. The vast majority of it goes to Brazil and to Europe. And so it really actually isn't even a problem from a drug enforcement point of view for the United States, but they're still insisting that Bolivia participate the way they want them to in the war on drugs. And of course, the idea of Venezuela being blamed because they happen to sit between the largest cocaine consuming country in the world and the largest producer is kind of ridiculous too. One other thing to follow up on what you guys said, there was another point I just wanted to, that I thought of when Joe mentioned that the border, number of people involved in border patrol has gone from 2,000 to 20,000 over the last 10 years, 30 years, from 77. I thought about that, and when I think of 77, that's basically about when Mexico's economy stopped growing. It was a fairly fast growing economy all the way, almost to 1980. From 60 to 80, it grew about 99% per capita in terms of income per person. And if it had just continued to grow at that rate, Mexico would have European living standards today. And that's not even a far-fetched idea because, a lot of countries grew a lot faster than, developing countries grew a lot faster than Mexico did in that period. And then since 1980, it's grown per capita, I don't know, maybe 20%, over 30 years, not 20. So that's why I think that's the source of a lot of these problems. You just have a failure of the economy to, at the very most basic level, regardless, even ignoring inequality and everything else. And that is one of the fundamental reasons why I think U.S. policy has not changed under Obama's. They don't even grasp this. They have no idea that their policies that they've recommended for the last 30 years have failed miserably, even by their own standards. And it's the worst economic failure in over a century in Latin America. And it hasn't really, you had a few years of reasonable growth until this recession. You had about 4 years, and then, obviously it went back again. And so, until that changes also, until they recognize their economic failure and start at least tolerating other economic policies, you're going to have this continued confrontation. Now, what I'm going to do is just try to give an overview of the diplomatic and non-diplomatic policies in various countries that have taken place since Obama took office. And I also believe, like both of you said, that this policy is, it's obviously there's a continuity. It's going to keep going. And one reason I already mentioned is the economic part of it. But the other, the failed economic policy. But the other reason I think you'll see more and more of these other forms of confrontation, including militarism, but also other covert activities. Like, for example, the United States is spending millions of dollars right now inside Venezuela and Bolivia. Okay, that comes from USAID. They acknowledge this. Okay, so that's not the covert stuff that we don't know about. And they refuse to disclose who the recipients are. And so that's part of their covert intervention. We don't even know. Now, Suzanna mentioned the September 2008 expulsion of the U.S. It was in September when they expelled him. Yeah, the U.S. ambassador in Bolivia. There's a good example. Now, what happened after they expelled the ambassador? Well, things got a lot better in Bolivia. Like a lot of they were on the brink. They had a lot of civil unrest. The opposition was pursuing an extra parliamentary strategy, and which included violence, and that kind of went away. Now, I don't think necessarily that the embassy was coordinating that like they have done in other countries, but they still played a fundamental, I think, political role in having that kind of support for the opposition there. And that was kind of a turning point for Bolivia. And they still don't have diplomatic relations. And why don't they have diplomatic relations? Well, that's because the Obama administration hasn't made any concessions on any of these issues. One is the drug war. They decertified Bolivia, as Suzanna mentioned. And the interesting thing about that is Bolivia's government now is the first government ever, in modern Bolivian history that did not have high officials implicated in the drug trade. None of the other previous governments were decertified. Only the present government is. So that also tells you a little bit about how much this really has to do with the actual market for illegal drugs. The second other points of friction that they have, what?
But in Bolivia, Coca is not illegal.
That's right, Coca is legal.
So they wouldn't be busted for...
No, I'm talking about cocaine. Not Coca. This is the first government that doesn't have high officials that were not implicated in cocaine trafficking, what we call drug. They don't call Coca drug trafficking. Yeah, sorry for not making that clear. So, two other points that the Obama administration has maintained hostilities with Bolivia. One was a dispute within the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So, right before they left office, the Bush administration filed a complaint against Bolivia because they had taken an exception for their healthcare industry of their prior agreement within the WTO. In other words, because they passed the new constitution did not allow for privatization of healthcare, prohibited privatization of healthcare services. So they had to change their prior agreement in the WTO. Well, that's not really that big of a deal, actually. The way the process works, if they make the exception and nobody objects within a certain period, I can't remember the exact length, it's not that long, then it's done. And nobody objected, the European countries didn't object, and the Obama administration, right before the deadline, objected. And so that's another point that they're expecting to be resolved through negotiation, and it's not going anywhere. The third point of disagreement for Bolivia is their trade preferences. They have preferences under the ATP-DEA, the Andean Trade Promotion and Drug Eradication Act, as it's called. And that gives them preferential access to the U.S. market. And this has been renewed for quite a long time. And it was revoked under the Bush administration. I think it was about 2 years ago. And the Obama administration was expected to reinstate it, and they have not. So all this is by way of just showing that, there's no effort. It's still a kind of a my way or the highway approach. They're not making concessions. And the Bush administration actually, towards the end, had more, I think, of a strategy of trying to isolate Venezuela. And so they got softer on the other countries that they didn't like Ecuador and even Bolivia. And the Obama administration kind of came in right away with more hostility, when a broader range of hostility. When Steinberg, I'm forgetting his first name, he's number 2 in the State Department after Hillary. When he was testifying in his confirmation hearings, he took a gratuitous swipe at both Bolivia and Venezuela in his testimony. And to me, that was a sign already that things were going to be bad, because there was no reason for that. And then, as we all know, there was that summit in Trinidad in April of last year, where Obama really did express a different attitude. He shook hands with Chavez, and that made a difference, actually. That photograph went all over the world. And, in Brazil, for example, the right wing, which is, very anti-Chavez, they actually ran into problems because of that, because the government said to them, well, look, Obama is making peace with Chavez. Why, what are you complaining about us? And So they looked, for a moment, and he definitely had a different attitude. But then, he personally, I think, did have a different attitude. But he didn't change any of the structures underneath him. And of course, he has Hillary Clinton for Secretary of State, who's very much a hardline Cold Warrior, and really, believes in the same kinds of things that the Bush administration pursued as strategy, not just as an ideology. So, that was reversed, almost immediately. That one gesture. In fact, it was immediate. Davidal, the guy who organized the summit for Obama, immediately started saying things about Chavez, so in order to provoke a fight, right after the handshake took place. So, where else do we see the kind of hostilities increasing and also involving militarization? Honduras is obviously the other example, and there's another workshop on that right now. So I won't go through the whole story, but I did spend 6 months working on it, and we did at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, trying to reverse the coup. So we followed it on a daily basis, the military coup of June 28th, and that was another example where if you follow the details, you could see very clearly that the intention of the Obama administration from day one, possibly before, we don't have the hard evidence yet, but from day one was to support that coup. Now, a lot of people don't know that. In fact, the press, the press eventually kind of turned against Obama on that, but the way they saw it was that he was against the coup and wanted to restore the democratically elected president, but caved to Republican pressure. Because, they held up those two nominations. They held up the nomination of Tom Shannon as ambassador to Brazil, who was Bush's head of the Western Hemisphere. And they held up the nomination of Arturo Valenzuela, who to the head of Western Hemisphere, Under Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere. But if you looked at it carefully, what you find is that changed only the public relations strategy of the administration. It did not change their overall political strategy. So they did, in fact, change their public relations strategy and a few things they said. But if you look at what they did, from the very beginning, they were doing everything they could to support the coup while still taking a position that they were against it. And I'll just give a couple of examples. Number one, the first day of the coup. When the coup happened, the White House issued a statement. The statement said all parties should try to work together to resolve this problem. The only government in the world that did not say we're against it, or the coup was wrong, or there's something we don't like about it, okay? That was a very telling statement. Because one, nobody got fired for putting out that statement. So that tells you it wasn't a mistake. The other thing that says it wasn't a mistake was that they knew about the coup in advance, which by their own acknowledgement, they were talking to the military right up to the day of the coup, allegedly to tell them not to do it, according to their version of the events. So the coup was not a surprise. They had plenty of time to think about what they would say, and they said something that made it clear to the entire diplomatic community, even if the press was too stupid to get it, that they were supporting this coup. That's the strongest statement that they could make, because they couldn't openly support it. Not even the Bush administration. They supported the Venezuelan coup in 2002, but in fact, they took that back within about 24 hours, as soon as all the other countries opposed it. So it was not possible for them to openly support it. That was as close as they could come. And then there were a series of other indications over the next weeks and months that indicated, again, only if you were paying close attention, that they supported the coup. Hillary Clinton was asked, twice within a few days of the coup if she supported the restoration of the elected president, and she refused to say yes. I mean, how hard of a question is that? The guy was elected, right? Then when President Zelaya made his first attempt to return to Honduras. Hillary denounced him for it and accused him of inciting violence. And the other, of course, the big thing was that for the entire, first 5 months of the dictatorship, there wasn't a single statement that came out of the White House or the State Department that condemned the violence committed by the dictatorship. People were shot and killed. There were mass arrests. They were beaten in the street. People were tortured. All the major human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and European organizations, made a lot of noise about it. And the U.S. government refused to say anything to condemn it during that whole period. They finally, under pressure, they finally said a little something at the very end, but it was very little and it was barely noticed. So that tells you very much that they wanted that government to succeed. They wanted to make sure they didn't do anything to undermine it. Finally, towards the end, they brokered an agreement for the return of President Zelaya, and then Tom Shannon, who was still then the Western Hemisphere, head of Western Hemisphere, who had brokered the agreement, went on TV just a few days later and said that it wasn't an agreement to take Zelaya back at all. So he totally stabbed Brazil and everybody else in the back. And then, of course, Obama appointed him ambassador to Brazil. So that was just one example where the United States really did everything it could under Obama to support a military dictatorship. And then, of course, against a democratically elected government. And then the final division between the United States and all of Latin America, even Colombia had to vote with the rest and sign a statement saying that they would refuse to recognize, the Rio Group signed a statement saying that they would refuse to recognize any government elected under the dictatorship in Honduras. And the United States went against the hemisphere. They had their usual right-wing allies, Canada, Panama, Colombia. And that's where it still stands. Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, they're still not giving in. They're not recognizing still the government of Honduras. Now, maybe they will. They might give in at some point. But that difference is really permanent. And I want to just tell you too, and this you would, if you're in Washington too, because all the embassies are there, just how much that alienated almost all the governments of South America. And I think it was part of the impetus behind the creation of the new regional organization that they did a few weeks ago, or an alternative to the Organization of American States, which excludes the United States and Canada. Because this was considered a real threat. I mean, some of them said this, Brazil, Ecuador, Lula, Correa. They said it publicly. This is a threat to us, because this is, going back to the days when you can overthrow an elected government and replace it with a military dictatorship. And yeah, sure, you go and have elections after that, after you've shut down the media and you've, repressed demonstrations and everything else for almost all of the whole 3-month campaign period in Honduras. And then you go and have elections. Well, that doesn't make it an election to us. And so that was, the fact that they were willing to do that, because they didn't have to do that, right? I mean, they have troops in Honduras. They have power there. They control that government, really. There were all kinds of things they could have done. They could have had economic sanctions against the country. They had almost none at all. They could have, George W. Bush's father actually had economic sanctions against the dictatorship of Haiti after they overthrew the government. The U.S. was involved in the overthrow. But because of international pressure, they actually froze the assets of the country and gave the money, gave millions of dollars to Aristide when he was in exile. I mean, that's just to give you an example of what a government that was completely on the wrong side did as a token gesture. And the Obama administration didn't even come close to that, because they really didn't care. They didn't care that the entire hemisphere knew what side that they were on. So that to me is the strongest example that we have a Cold War that's still raging between the United States and especially South America, but really all of Latin America. And there's no let-up in sight. Now, you could see more of this in the latest trip that Hillary Clinton took. She met with the Brazilians, for example, and tried to pressure Lula to reverse his position on Iran. The Brazilians don't support further economic sanctions against Iran. And they made some very good statements. They said, look, we've been down this path before. We know what happened. You had a war that was unnecessary. It was all based on things that were false. They didn't use the word lie. But they basically said, this is dangerous. We don't want to back them into a corner. We should negotiate. And they wanted to talk about a whole other agenda. They have other things on the agenda, and all Hillary wanted to talk about with them was Iran. And it's not very smart, even from a diplomatic point of view. If you really want to change their position, you would at least maybe think that not to announce it publicly, and because that doesn't make it easier for them to do that. But no, she was down there just mafia style, telling them all what to do. And that was pretty much, she was friendlier in Argentina, definitely. But she also took a few swipes at Venezuela. And I should say a couple of things about that, because that's a serious confrontation as well. How much time do I have left?
You want to wrap up?
Okay. So I think the Venezuelan situation that's the most confrontational of all, as it has been for the last 6 years. But that also ebbs and flows, I mean, there are constraints. They are still sending over 1 million barrels of oil to the United States. So I think this administration has just launched a very aggressive campaign against Venezuela. It's just started. And this is very ominous, because the campaign is definitely timed to coincide with the elections they're having in September. They're having National Assembly legislative elections for the first time in, it's only every 5 years. Now, in the last election, 2005, the opposition boycotted the election because they were still pursuing kind of an insurrectionary strategy. They had participated in the referendum in 2004. They lost. They said, the hell with this, we're going back to where we were. And they boycotted the election. And they tried to delegitimize the election, and it didn't really work. The media didn't really go for it. Most of the media didn't accept that this election is somehow not legitimate just because people who know they're going to lose decide to pull out. I mean, some papers did, but most of them didn't, and neither did the OAS. So the question is, what are they going to do this time? Now, there are a couple of possibilities. They can participate, they can boycott, or they can participate and then refuse to recognize the results when they don't get a majority. And what the United States is doing by Hillary, just completely unprovoked, unleashing hostile rhetoric towards Venezuela, the other, other steps that they've taken. There's a resolution that Senator Dodd was going to introduce into the Senate. There was a whole, and then there was the Inter-American Human Rights Commission report, which was heavily influenced by the United States, the timing of it especially. They haven't had a report on Colombia in 11 years, but human rights is very serious in Venezuela, the human rights situation. It's very serious in Venezuela. So that indicates to me why I think that is going to be very bad over the next 6 months, is because what they're doing is they're sending a signal to the opposition that even though this might, in the short run, help Chavez for us to be denouncing him, we're doing it because we want to delegitimize the government and the elections in case you all decide you want to boycott or not accept the results. Okay, so I'll end it there. That's the overall view.
You've been listening to a panel discussion from the Left Forum, which took place on March 20th, 2010. The panel was organized by the North American Congress on Latin America. The topic for the panel was Obama's militarized status quo in Latin America. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer session from the presentation. The panel was chaired by Christy Thornton, a graduate student in the History Department at New York University, and former director of the North American Congress on Latin America. Also taking part in the panel was Mark Weisbrot of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, Suzanna Reiss, assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Hawaii, and Josehp Nevins of the Department of Earth Science and Geography at Vassar College. To find out more about the North American Congress on Latin America, please visit their website at NACLA.org. The panel took place as part of the 2010 Left Forum, held at Pace University in Manhattan, New York. And for more information about the Left Forum, please visit their website at leftforum.org. And now we return to the question and answer session from the presentation.
I think something that really struck me when the three of you were talking about these kinds of various different issues is the way in which the United States continues to view Latin America, particular countries within Latin America and Latin America as a whole, as a threat, right? As though, and it's something that Joe said in the beginning, that there is very much this feeling that there is a threat that has now been folded under the sort of national security paradigm from these countries to the United States. And I'm just wondering, from each of your perspectives, what you think about that, and if there is any prospect for that changing. Because obviously, on the face of it, it seems massively irrational, right? to see these countries as some sort of a inherent threat, an actual bodily threat to the security of the United States. So I'm just wondering what you think about that issue.
Well, me either.
Sure, go ahead.
Well, I don't think they really see it as a threat. I think they portray it as a threat. I mean, they know pretty well that none of these countries has a military or anything that could possibly threaten the United States, even if in a regional conflict. So I think they portray it as a threat, and because that's what works here, right? Especially post September 11th, and all the, security is the way to do it. Obviously, the part of the big rationale for the drug war, it gets them a lot of, this is the way they get to know officers in the various militaries. And like Honduras, for example, who has 400 officers in their military that were trained in the School of the Americas. So I think they portray it as a threat because that is the way they can have their Cold War approach. There's a good list and a bad list, and it varies depending on whether you do what we want you to do. So I see that continuing until there's some kind of turning point where Obama, I don't think it's going to happen, but it would have to be something where he gets up and makes a speech where he recognizes, it's kind of like an alcoholic. If they don't recognize they have a drinking problem, they're probably not going to get better, And there has to be an actual recognition that they don't have to confess to all their past crimes or anything, but just recognize that their approach was wrong, That you just don't really see, although you do see it increasingly in the policy circles, even the ones, the Inter-American Dialogue and the Council on Foreign Relations, and those, mainstream establishment organizations increasingly realize what the State Department doesn't acknowledge, that it's been a complete failure and the approach is wrong. So, but that doesn't mean that any change is in the foreseeable future.
Right. Do you guys have thoughts on that?
The only thing I might add to that is that I think that so much of American economic policy is promoted through a militaristic approach, and that depends on, in some way it's failed, but it's succeeded in other ways. It's succeeded in securing the military, securing access to military bases, becoming one of those kind of motor forces of American presence in the region. And so I think that it conforms to a vision of how America is promoting its economic interest in the world through depending on a military approach to accomplish that. And so I think that it's sort of a pact with the devil in a sense that's it's self-reinforcing. It kind of creates a cycle where it depends on the image of a threat to justify perpetuating that. I guess those kinds of strategy and tactics that Mark was describing. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that. But,
Mark said something to the effect that they don't really believe. Mark said something to the effect that the administration doesn't really perceive them as a threat, but they frame them as a threat, right? Frame Latin America as a threat. And in many ways, I think that's true. At the same time, I mean, in the sense that, I mean, there's all sorts of different types of insecurities in the United States, right? We could talk about what those are, right? And to the extent that the insecurities are identified as threats from without, whether it's terrorists or drug runners or whatever it might be, unauthorized migrants, this upholds a particular status quo and facilitates the interests of certain groups in society. And if you were to redefine the source of those insecurities, it would call into question that status quo and the resulting social relations, right? So clearly there's a benefit to the extent that it helps divert attention from other causes of insecurity. At the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge or to recognize how successful this particular framing. Oh, sorry about that, Will. Okay. How successful this particular framing has been in terms of creating people's consciousness. Right? When you go and you talk to people in the border region, for example, and I'm not talking about just Border Patrol agents, but they would be sort of emblematic of that. There's a lot of people they truly believe, right, that the United States needs a strong presence along the U.S.-Mexico boundary because there's terrorist threats. Right? Now, the fact that no terrorists have ever been caught, right, that there is no proof that there's any serious existential threat coming from south of the U.S.-Mexico boundary is almost irrelevant. Right? People believe it. And in many ways, this has been the great success of the Department of Homeland Security and the whole sort of national security apparatus. Right? And we on the left have to figure out a way, besides just saying you're wrong, right? And I've tried that, right? And with some people that works. Figure out a way to challenge people's deep assumptions, but at the same time provide them with a sense of security, right? That moves beyond sort of the yes/no game, right? You're right. You're wrong, et cetera, if that makes sense. Okay.
The first member of the audience with a question observed that there are two ways that countries in Latin America pose a threat. The first is that alternative models for development, or forms of government, pose a threat by presenting another model, a contrast with the forms imposed by the United States. The case of Venezuela offers examples of communes and town councils as forms of participatory democracy and different forms of citizen engagement. The Union of South American Nations, UNASUR, the Bolivian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, ALBA, and other organizations are efforts to challenge the various so-called free trade agreements that have been part of the U.S. economy dominating Latin America. This is seen most clearly with respect to U.S. policy toward Cuba, which is still listed by the United States as a terrorist nation. Cuba has been the victim of terrorist attacks time and again, attacks condoned or sponsored by the United States. And yet the U.S. continues to list Cuba as a terrorist nation and continues to subject the Cuban people to a devastating economic embargo. In other words, rather than a military threat, these examples are a threat to the class-structured, hierarchical, grossly anti-egalitarian, corporate-dominated American way of life. The presentations today have been very valuable, but we have not yet discussed the so-called free trade agreements and how these free trade agreements have been enforced by the U.S. military on behalf of the corporations that benefit from them, in the face of opposition and resistance from the peoples of the region, resistance from popular movements and from Cuba, aimed at reclaiming control over their natural resources. With regard to what we can do, Brooklyn for Peace will be hosting Father Roy Bourgeois here on May 15th. Father Roy Bourgeois is one of the founders of the School of the Americas Watch, a campaign to close down the U.S. training programs for soldiers from Latin American dictatorships and authoritarian regimes. This member of the audience took note of the statistic that 400 graduates from the U.S. training program took part in the coup in Honduras, and that the leader of the coup was a graduate of the School of the Americas, now called WINSEC, the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation.
So, do you guys have responses about the connections between the military apparatus and the free trade? That is one thing that we only touched on kind of briefly. And Suzanna, you mentioned kind of briefly, especially with the Andean agreement.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is a threat. I mean, again, I don't know that it's a threat that is. It's not to everybody in the United States, but to the dominant interests in the United States that right now are defining America's role in the world and that type of relationship. So I think. In terms of drug control, it is. I mean, the fact that we both mentioned the Andean Trade Agreement and Drug Eradication Act, that those things are intimately connected. That the reason why Bolivia was decertified was because Evo Morales his government has begun to really present a challenge to the idea that the natural resources of the country can be extracted without the benefits going back to the people within the country. And so there are new constitutions being introduced, partial nationalization. I mean, people talk about what he's done as having actually nationalized many of the industries, which he hasn't, in fact. But he has actually introduced that as an issue that should be on the table, and that there should be more of the profits that are being derived from particularly the natural gas industry actually accruing back to the nation rather than being exported out of the country to American corporate coffers. So I think those things are really, really intimately connected. And I mean, drugs are just sort of one example of how that works. But I think across the region, there have been, particularly I think, indigenous-led movements that are really challenging the kind of neoliberal order that has been so prominent in American priorities in the region. And so I think that you have to absolutely talk about the economic and the military as being two sides of the same policy.
Well, I don't have that much to add. I mean, I think the U.S. had a strategy of trying to have a hemispheric agreement, the free trade area of the Americas, and they lost that. 2005 was kind of the last gasp of that. And how much more could they get? They can't seem to get the Colombia agreement.
Where is that?
It can't get past the House in Congress. Yeah. And so I think it is, there's definitely a relationship. I guess I tend to see the foreign policy, I focus on the economics, that's mostly what I write about, so I definitely think it's important. But I do think that in terms of overall strategy, the State Department, their interests of empire tend to predominate. Just to give you one example, like the biggest oil companies in the U.S. would have left Chavez alone for most of the last 7 years. They were operating there, and they would have. They wanted stability, and those are powerful corporations in the United States. They have a big lobby, but they weren't enough to prevent the State Department from pursuing a strategy of destabilization. So when push comes to shove, I think the empire interests kind of dominate. But that's not to say that there aren't huge and powerful economic interests that are mostly allied with maintaining control over the whole area.
Well, and on that point, obviously there are sort of short-term interests and long-term interests, and the United States as an empire has always very much, the United States government has many times acted against the economic interests of specific corporations in the interest of a larger sense of economic stability or economic gain. And so if you look at, the particular movements in isolation in that way, you might not see the sort of broader way in which the United States is maintaining its hegemony, even if it goes against individual members of sort of the capitalist class. So,
but they really are losing. I mean, in South America, for example, even before the last few years, their trade with the United States was maybe 15% of their total trade. So they're not as integrated. Say Mexico has 75% of its trade with the U.S. And so now they're going in another direction. They really lost that region because of their policies. So it's very hard to say. I mean, some of it is just really blindness and the unwillingness to adjust to a new reality too, so it isn't, you can't define it that well in terms of their interest because they're not doing what's necessarily in their interest because they're too stupid. I was trying to avoid the word. They're too incompetent. There's a lot of incompetence there, there's no doubt about that.
In the back?
The next member of the audience asked about encouraging trends towards more independent economic policies in Latin America. In particular, President Rafael Correa's decision to default on $3.2 billion of Ecuador's national debt.
I've written about that, and I think that it's a very important example. I mean, first of all, the default was very successful. They got rid of a third of their debt. It was a very brazen move. I mean, the financial press was infuriated because he wasn't backed against the wall. Like Argentina had no choice but to default in 2002, or it was the end of 2001. But Ecuador could have paid, but they set up a commission, an international commission, to look at the debt and decide whether it was legitimate and how it was contracted, and they decided that certain parts of it were not legitimate, and for various reasons, which I could go into if we had more time. And on that basis, they defaulted, and they did it very cleverly as well. They bought up part of it when it was, after it fell to like 30-something cents on the dollar. It was a very good strategy. And they came out with a credit rating that was no worse than what they had, prior. So it was very successful. And it was, it was very gutsy. I mean, it's the kind of thing that really makes you a lot of enemies. And they did it. During the crisis, for example, as the recession hit, the vast majority of countries in this hemisphere shrank during 2009, including, of course, the United States. Mexico lost 8% of GDP. Ecuador came out with just a little bit of growth, which was very good for them because they are very constrained. They have the dollar as their currency, so they couldn't use exchange rate policy, and they couldn't use monetary policy, the two most important policies. So what did they do? They did a lot of unorthodox things. They forced their banks to bring more money back into the country. They used the rules that they could within the WTO to restrict some trade in order to keep the economy growing. So they did a whole set of economic policies that were unorthodox in order to avoid getting, hard hit by the recession. And so overall, and there were other policies. I mean, they also did other good things that they had promised. They doubled spending on health care. They, increased other forms of social spending, and they had huge battles to fight. And then they have this big fight against Chevron, the $25 billion lawsuit. They're not backing down on any of these things, and they've managed to keep their trade preferences, although they've been threatened many times under the Andean, the ATP-DEA. We'll see how long that lasts. I think they probably will manage to do it. And again, partly, this is what people don't realize. Partly they have this space because both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, they've decided that Venezuela is the bad. And it's not because anything that Chavez has actually done, believe it or not. It really is because they have oil. I mean, that is why they're not going to let go of that one. Whereas they'll let Ecuador slide, depending on whether they think it's strategically best to do that. So that's my too long answer.
Was there any reaction here in the United States to the Ecuador default from a governmental standpoint, or was it just in the sort of financial?
They don't take a position on that in general because it's too. It would provoke too much hostility. I mean, they have to pretend that they're neutral on it.
Wouldn't the other thing about Ecuador be the fact that they refused to renew the lease on the military base in Manta?
Oh yeah, that's another big thing. Yeah, they kept that promise.
Which is what leads to the new base agreement in Colombia, is that Ecuador refused to sign the renewal for the base on Manta, and that it was then replaced by these 7 bases in Colombia that are now.
It was great what Correa said when he said, "We'll let you renew the lease in Manta if you'll let us have a base in Miami."
Right.
Several members of the audience asked about the situation in Mexico, observing that the increases in violence attributed to the illegal drug trade have given Mexico the appearance of a country without a government. They asked the members of the panel to comment on the apparent crisis in Mexico today.
I wouldn't want to underestimate the horrific things that are happening in different places, especially in Ciudad Juarez. At the same time, I think sometimes one can get an exaggerated perception of what life is like in some of these places. So after Ciudad Juarez, the city that's often held up as being out of control is Tijuana. Right? 2008 was the most violent year in Tijuana's history in terms of murders. If Tijuana had been an American city, right, its murder rate, proportionally speaking, right, would be number 4 in the United States. Right? Detroit, New Orleans, and St. Louis were more violent in 2008.
Right, all those are war zones too, though.
Yeah. Well,
but we don't have the image that we have.
Right. I mean, people are living their lives, right? I mean, you
streets of Detroit.
So again, it's not to underestimate what or downplay the horrors that are unfolding in different areas, but it does provide a different lens on sort of what's unfolding. And I just want to echo what Suzanna's saying. I mean, we really have to. I mean, this war. It's hard to find a set of policies that have been a more abysmal failure on all levels in the war on drugs, right? And ultimately, I mean, it speaks to the need to end the war, right? To end the war and find a total different way for dealing with it, because this is the logical outcome. Just as Prohibition produced the Capones and the Kennedy family, right? And the violence that was associated with them. Right? So.
I mean, and despite what really feels like, and maybe this is the case in Washington as well, it really feels as though there is some momentum, the gathering idea that this war has failed. But despite this, you saw last year places like the Council on Foreign Relations coming out with massive reports holding up Plan Colombia as the model, whereas 6 years prior they had issued a report that said Plan Colombia is an abysmal failure, get rid of it. Now, in this political context, the CFR comes out with a report that says Plan Colombia is the model. Let's go with in the Merida initiative. Let's continue to push this, continue this funding, and stop the war in Mexico in that way. And so despite what feels like some gathering momentum for ending the war in some extra governmental kind of policy analysis circles, then you see things like this CFR report that is now holding up Plan Colombia as the model for where we go from here.
How do you understand that shift over the 6 years?
I understand that shift through Hugo Chavez. I mean, I really think that it's the regional politics. It's the idea of holding up Colombia at all costs as against Venezuela. And it seems unrelated, right? It's not directly related, but it is the sort of the metaphor of Colombia as the Israel of South America, the sort of unconditional support at all costs, I think is where that comes from. And I think it's obviously really dangerous having these sort of high-level policy conversations that have now made this switch back to the idea that Plan Colombia is successful on its own terms, even, which obviously it's not, is really dangerous for where the drug war is going, the militarization is going.
The next member of the audience raised the concern that the left has often viewed drugs and drug use as liberatory. He argued that this attitude on the left needs to be interrogated critically, and that the war on drugs, even dating back to the Opium War of the British, has always been part of imperialism and imperial strategies. He asked the members of the panel to discuss the strategy of legalization for putting an end to the war on drugs.
Do you have thoughts on legalization, Suzanna, on where we are here in the United States and how much that's a part of the dialogue?
I think there are dangerous drugs, and drugs can be dangerous. But I think that the current way that in the economy and the illegal market is policed have much more devastating consequences than the drugs themselves. And that the majority of people in prison in the United States are there on nonviolent drug charges. The majority of people who benefit from the trade aren't the ones that end up in the crosshairs. And I think that in that sense, legalization. The majority of dangerous drugs out there are legal. Actually, the majority that people are dying from taking and overdosing on are legal drugs. And so I feel like the entire conversation of going after illegal drugs is sort of missing the mark of what is generating dangerous overconsumption of drugs. And I think that has much more to do with sort of capitalist incentives to make profit off of selling drugs, whether that's cartels in Mexico or pharmaceutical companies in the United States, than actually the drugs themselves. And so I think that the conversation has to sort of shift, not to glorify drugs, but to figure out a more humane way of dealing with distribution and consumption and real medical benefits that can come. And addiction, in a capitalist consumer culture that fosters excessive consumption of all sorts of things to an unhealthy degree, because it depends on people buying and consuming, to maintain a mass-produced commodity market. I think that those are the kinds of questions that really have to be put on the table if there's going to be any kind of fundamental solution to the real sort of devastating consequences of the drug war. And so that I think you're right. I think that there's a real limited, the dialogue about the drug war is very, very limited right now, in that it focuses on legal or illegal rather than thinking about the kind of politics that are really embedded in designating drugs as being dangerous, as being legal, as being illegal. So I would just say, I don't know.
I want to thank the panelists for being here, all three of you for coming in.
You've been listening to a panel discussion from the Left Forum, which took place on March 20th, 2010. The panel was organized by the North American Congress on Latin America. The topic for the panel was Obama's Militarized Status Quo in Latin America. To find out more about the North American Congress on Latin America, please visit their website at NACLA.org. This program was produced by PDX Justice Media Productions of Portland, Oregon. To find out more about our work and to access our growing library of free on-demand streaming video and audio programs, please visit our website at pdxjustice.org and write to us with your comments and questions at pdxjustice@riseup.net. Many of our programs are available on DVD or Blu-ray disc. Please write to us for ordering information. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic community media.